Good evening. My name is Nancy Keegan Smith, and I am president of Flair. I am excited about welcoming you tonight to Flair's program on Inside the Wardrobe, First Ladies, and the Politics of Fashion. And I think we will have a fascinating discussion. The moderator is Nikki Gutgold, professor of communication at Penn State Lehigh and author Annette B. Dunlap. So I think that it is an issue that First Ladies often want to get away from and resent that the press comments on them so much. But we will have, I know, a really excellent discussion. Flair has new and innovative programming, so be sure to check flair-net.org to learn about our programs. We have several podcasts that we have done with transcripts that are just fascinating. And please watch for our announcements. We have our fourth podcast is coming on shortly. I would like to thank our lifetime institutional members, 12 of them, and all of Flair's individual members. Our collaborative projects with our institutional, life, and regular members make Flair a truly vital organization and help to fulfill its mission of promoting research and education about the lasting legacy and impact of U.S. First Ladies. Please watch for our email announcements so that you can keep up with Flair's programming. So I am going to turn it over tonight. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Nikki for what I know will be a wonderful program. Nikki.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's so exciting tonight to have Annette B. Dunlap with us. Annette is an independent scholar. She is author of the biographies of First Ladies, Frances Folsom Cleveland and Lou Henry Hoover. She was a panelist on C-SPAN's First Lady series, appearing on the broadcast for Frances Cleveland and Lou Hoover. Annette was a panelist at the Harding Symposium program, Modern First Ladies, hosted by Ohio State. She is a contributor to the recently released book, What the Presidents Read, with an article about Lou Henry Hoover, and she has written the entry on Helen Herron Taft for the forthcoming book about Ohio's First Ladies. Annette became interested in First Ladies' fashions after writing an article for White House History Quarterly on Frances Cleveland's wardrobe. Her presentation at the Herbert Hoover Library, First Ladies and the Politics of Fashion, was recorded by C-SPAN. Please welcome Annette B. Dunlap.
Thank you, Nikki. It's great to be with you and with all of our people who have joined us this evening. I'm looking forward to sharing some information with you regarding our First Ladies and the whole issues surrounding the politics of fashion. So let's take a look at our first slide, and we'll go over the outline of what we are going to be covering. So one of the things that's rather interesting is that in the colonial times, we found that there were efforts on the part of a lot of the men who were involved in politics to try to create the idea of a national wardrobe. The idea was to get away from the extravagance of European fashions, to simplify the look that women had, to get them away from purchasing fabrics that were very expensive and lavish, and to get involved with wearing homespun, cotton, and linen, and more simplified fabrics. So we have an outline slide that details this. And so we have the national look, and the fact of the matter is that women didn't want to buy into this idea of dressing down, if you will. So it wasn't until the imposition of what were called the Intolerable Acts, which included taxes on finished fabrics, in other words, clothing that was coming back into the colonies from England, which had been made out of fiber that had been sent to the colonies, to England from the colonies. And so there became a national movement to move to homespun. And homespun was from cotton or linen. There were homespun parties there. And what the homespun parties ended up doing was allow the women to discuss politics and become even more patriotic toward the colonies and the idea of pursuing independence. So we'll talk a little bit about how homespun was adopted by Martha Washington during George Washington's first administration and when the capital was still in New York City. But eventually, American women went back to wanting to dress beautifully, to look like the French, to look like the royalty of the British. And so we will take a look at the French connection. And the French connection in American fashion stays with not only our first ladies, but most women in the upper classes for nearly a century. And so we'll take a look at that. From the very beginning, starting with Martha Washington, the idea of what the First Lady wore has become front and center. Part of that is because culturally, women were not expected to engage in politics. So what they wore was used as a form of communication for their support for their husband's policies and to promote what their husband was attempting to do in his presidency. And that has definitely not changed. We are now getting ready to celebrate our 250th anniversary, and we are still at a place where we analyze what a woman has on, what the First Lady has on, and tie it back to what she is saying about what her husband is about. And if there are disconnects, as we have seen to some extent with Melania Trump versus what her husband is doing, then it raises other questions and other discussions about what the First Lady is trying to communicate with the clothing that she has chosen to wear. I've already mentioned that one of the part of the national look was the idea that women should dress with modesty, that they should always have sleeves, that they should not show too much décolleté, and that they should not wear things that would call attention to their shape or to their female sexuality. And again, we will find that there are certain aspects of what women first ladies will wear that will raise questions and bring critique. And then finally, we have several first ladies who have become influencers and trendsetters for the nation. Most recently, of course, was Michelle Obama, who really took to heart the opportunities that celebrating fashion gave her to raise awareness of minority designers and designers who had emigrated to the United States and had established careers here. So before we get started in looking at individual first ladies, let's take a look at a quote from Valerie Steele, who is the director and chief curator of the Museum of the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. In a presentation that she was a part of at the National Archives, Valerie said, "The First Lady's role is an ambassador for both her husband's administration and for the United States. That's her job in a sense." And so, I think, and to some extent, many of us might consider this a somewhat sexist comment, but in reality, given that we have yet to have a woman president and see what's going to happen with the first gentleman and the clothing he decides to wear, we still continue to look at the First Lady as being very secondary in terms of her role within the administration, instead of seeing her as a primary and co-equal partner. And the emphasis on clothing tends to reinforce that. And yet that is the expectation of the public. And as most first ladies have discovered, many to their chagrin, nothing has really changed since Martha Washington ascended to the first ladyship. So let's start by looking at homespun, which was attempted, as I mentioned in the introduction, to become what many men hoped, including men like Robert Livingston, an influential politician out of New York State, and Benjamin Franklin, both of whom wrote columns and articles that were published in newspapers promoting homespun, promoting modesty, and an effort to make homespun what you might call the new national fabric. And if we study a couple of portraits of Martha Washington, we begin to see this transition that she makes. Martha was an extremely wealthy woman. She had inherited her husband's estate, her first husband's estate, John Dandridge. She helped George Washington to build on that foundation and accrue even more wealth. And if you'll look at the picture that's on the left of your screen, it's 1776. This is a painting by Peel. And I look very carefully at this painting. You can see in Martha's hair that she's got a hair ornament that has pearls in it. And if you'll look at what would be her right shoulder, it's on our left, you will see this string of beads. That's actually the rest of the hair ornament that's attached to the crown of her head. And it's coming all the way down the back of her head, and then it swings around there on her shoulder. And that is made up of gold and ivory. And then you see the pearl choker that is around her neck. Then you can look at the lace in the collar of this gown. So you get the impression when you look at the 1776 portrait of a very wealthy woman wearing fine jewelry and very lavish fabrics. So now we go to the picture that's on the right. First, I want to say you will notice it's the 1850 painting. And of course, the question is, okay, well, where did this come from? Obviously, it's a somewhat stylized portrait of what people expected that Martha Washington had looked like. It's taken from other sketches that were made during her lifetime. But what I want to point out in this comparison is that Martha is wearing absolutely no jewelry in this painting. She is wearing an extremely simple gown with a simple kerchief that is around her neck to give her modesty. And this is the transition that occurred when she became First Lady. There is an article in the New York, it's the New York newspaper when she arrived in New York City. Now, so George Washington had been sworn in at the end of April of 1789. And she did not arrive in New York City until roughly the end of May. And the comment is made that she was wearing a very simple white dress. And what little we're able to learn from reading about accounts of what she was wearing, particularly during this first year of the presidency in New York City, was she maintained a high degree of simplicity. There are comments and letters that the fabrics that she chose were high quality, which suggests that they may have been imported again from Britain. But she was staying away from the idea of the laces and the brocades and the jewelry that was evident in this portrait in 1776. What we also found out is that when the capital moves to Philadelphia, she does begin to dress a little more lavishly, but still not to the extent of how she would have been dressing before she had become First Lady. And this really sets the stage because from Abigail Adams on, there is this idea that you sort of look at what your predecessor has done. And if it has been successful, then there is an effort to try to emulate what that First Lady has done. And Abigail Adams was very much like that. She looked at Martha Washington. She saw her very much as a role model. And in addition to that, Abigail had already been in Europe when John Adams had been ambassador to Great Britain, when they had served in France. And she had Abigail had been presented at court. She had tried not to have to wear all of the fine gown and all the other accoutrements that were required to be presented to the Queen. She realized that she was going to have to get into it, accept that and do it. And then when she got back to the United States, there was this idea that women who dressed to emulate the Queen of England were royalists, and those who were dressing in the simplicity of homespun were patriotic. And that's part of where you get the whole concept of both Martha and Abigail choosing to, what we would say, dress down. And there's a very interesting thesis, a master's thesis that was written, and the title of it is Martha Washington from Fashion Icon to Frump. And it's a very good discussion about the changes that Martha made in her attire in order to conform with political expectations. So I've got a couple of examples of the fabric. If you'll look at the top of the slide, you'll see on the left striped silk. You'll see on the right silk brocade. And silk was definitely not grown or cultivated here. It was definitely an imported fabric. It would have been woven. We did not have weaving mills at the time of the independence because Britain had forbade that the technology for weaving mills be exported. So we did not have the mills to do this weaving. So this is all being done either in Britain or France from silk that most likely had been imported from China, or France was also involved with trying to cultivate silkworms and build its own silk industry. Then you have in the bottom an artifact of homespun. You can see the difference in the weave. And if we were able to get this in more of a close-up, you have much coarser fabric, a much looser weave, and it's considerably simpler both in design and in fabric quality for how it's going to end up being transformed into a garment, how it's going to hang on a person, and what the message is going to convey somebody who's wearing that type of fabric. But as I mentioned earlier, it did not stay that way forever. So when Dolley Madison gets into the White House, she adopts French fashion. Now, what happens in France is you have three women, including the woman who would become Josephine Bonaparte, who actually are behind the idea of getting rid of corsets and stays and all kinds of restrictive undergarments and just dress naturally. So you can see on the left are some gowns that were very typical of the late 1700s, early 1800s, that reflected the change in fashion that was being influenced by the women who were involved with the French Revolution. And you can see Dolley here on the right with a very low-cut bodice, high-waisted gown. She's not standing, but we know from looking at the photo on the left-hand side, it's unrestricted in her movement. And then when you look at the other thing that made Dolley very famous was she loved turbans, which is on the next slide. And you can see here, she would take scarves and she would just wrap them around her head. Women absolutely loved Dolley. The combination of her winning personality, her ability to bring in different people of different political viewpoints and encourage them to have conversations with one another in a social setting, endeared her to politicians of all stripes, and particularly endeared her to their wives, because there is this kind of behind the scenes political atmosphere among the women where they visit with themselves, they discuss the political issues of the day, they are having conversations with their husbands, and then these people are getting together for social events in the evening where those discussions are furthered. Dolley was masterful at being able to bring these people together. And because she was masterful and being accepted, her decision to adopt French fashion, to wear the looser, more relaxed gowns, to wrap turbans around her, or scarves around her head and create turbans, women wanted to emulate her. And so there was an adaptation among many American women, particularly those in Washington, to adopt French style and to adopt French fashion. And we continue to see this idea of returning to wearing clothing that comes from the French. When we look at what Angelica Singletary Van Buren wore during her service as First Lady to her father-in-law, Martin Van Buren. You can see her on her left. This is when we began to get the introduction of what were called the big mutton sleeves, the high collar. But what I want to call your attention to is where you have the arrow on the right-hand side. I want you to take a look at the neckline of this gown. And if you can see it, you will see that there are what look to be pleated folds in the bodice. And so that particular look was very popular among the French. And we'll see in a couple of slides a plate from a seamstress and actually a designer is what we would call her today, Madame Udo Manuri. And since I took German and not French, I apologize to all of you French majors for what was probably a very butchered pronunciation. So then when James Polk gets into office, Sarah Polk really becomes the nation's new Dolley Madison. When you read articles that are in the newspapers, you will see that when she is mentioned, she is always mentioned as being very gracious. She is mentioned as being very intelligent, and it's said in a way that's not derogatory, that she is a good helpmeet to her husband, that she is lauded for her faith. She did not serve alcohol in the White House. She insisted that her husband observe the Sabbath day. And while it's kind of hard to see in this painting of her, again, you see that design and that style that is very, very similar to the style that Angelica Van Buren was wearing, which again is the pleated look on the bodice. So you'll recall that I mentioned early on in the program that we have about 100 years of French influence on our fashion. And one of the reasons for that is because there was an English gentleman who went back up. Yeah, there you go. There was an English gentleman by the name of Charles Frederick Worth who went to France to begin to study dressmaking. And he was working in another atelier at the time. This happens to be Sarah's inaugural gown. Again, you see that same motif in the bodice that I have been pointing out. And there is some evidence that he was in this atelier when Sarah ordered this gown to be worn to her husband's inauguration. And when we look at this, this is the plate I was talking about. So the dress on the on the left, is another gown of Sarah's that looks very much like what her inaugural gown looked like. And on the right, left hand, sorry, I do have a little bit of directional dyslexia. On the right hand side of the page is the plate that was in many of the fashion magazines from this Madame Manuri. That was the fashion that she was promoting and that you can see was adopted by Americans during the 1830s, 1840 time period. So when we begin to move forward, then we start to see just the first inkling of the idea of Mary Todd and what I'm going to call the beginning of American dress. So Mary's inaugural gown bears a strong resemblance to the gowns that we have been looking at, with that V-neck bodice and with the pleats in the bodice, somewhat bared shoulders. Mary liked to have flowers on the bodice. She liked to wear flowers in her hair. As so many other things, unfortunately, with her, she was criticized for that look. We know that Mary outspent her husband's salary considerably. It is said she probably spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $27,000 to have her dresses made, and Abraham Lincoln's salary at that time was $25,000. So she was asking his secretaries for money to help pay for her wardrobe. She had this idea, even though the nation was in the middle of a war, that she still had a responsibility to look elegant and to convey the seriousness of the White House, the importance of the White House in the national psyche. As I have heard one commentator say, she would have been a fantastic first lady with her ethos in another time period when the nation was not at war. But it was a case of just a very poorly chosen and a poor understanding of what the nation was looking for at this time. Although I would dare say that even if she had, quote unquote, dressed down, I'm sure she would have had her critics panning her on failing to understand the seriousness of the First Lady and how she ought to represent it by dressing better. But where we begin to see a movement toward manufacturing in the United States comes from Mary's dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley. As I'm sure most of you know, Elizabeth Keckley was a freed, enslaved person who had learned how to be a seamstress while she was enslaved. She used her skill and her talents to buy her freedom from her owner when she was living in St. Louis, eventually made her way to Washington, and gets selected by Mary Todd Lincoln to help make dresses for her. And you can see that these are 3 dresses that Elizabeth Keckley designed and crafted for Mary Todd Lincoln, and these are all day dresses. And you can see that the craftsmanship and the quality of the fabric is absolutely beautiful. But it's also the start of beginning to understand that the growth of American fashion. But we still have the French influence. So when Frances Folsom Cleveland becomes First Lady, prior to her marriage to Grover Cleveland in June of 1886, she had gone for a year in Europe, and she had money from her grandfather to purchase a trousseau, and she had quite a number of items that were made from the House of Worth. By the time Frances gets to Paris, Charles Frederick Worth has opened his own couturier house. He has created what we now call today haute couture, and it was the idea of being able to elevate fashion in such a way that people who selected and wore the clothing that he was making, particularly the women that he was making clothing for, were women that were in the upper echelons of society, and were using their this haute couture, to demonstrate where they saw their status in the social hierarchy. So Frances has purchased some Worth gowns, one of which is this gown that's on the left-hand side. And when Frances appeared in this gown with her shoulders bared, she got letters from the Women's Christian Temperance Union asking that she would dress more modestly, that she had, as a young woman, she had a responsibility to set an example for other young women, and that she should not be wearing sleeveless and she should not be wearing décolleté. So I think Frances's answer to those letters was the gown she chose to wear for her official portrait, which is on the right, which she had sat for in 1899. And you can see that this gown is even lower cut in the bodice than the gown on the left. And again, she is baring her arms. So one of the things that we hear about Frances Cleveland, and I'm embarrassed to say that as a novice biographer back in 08 and 09, I kind of passed this along as truth, but it's pretty much been determined it's urban legend. But there was a very bored news reporter in 1887, and it was the middle of the summer. Washington was closed up. All the members of Congress had gone home. The Clevelands had gone away for the summer. And so this news reporter decided that in order to stir up some interest and to get some people to buy newspapers, he would announce that Frances Cleveland had stopped wearing the bustle. So let's take a look at how the bustle evolved. The bustle, as it was designed to extend a woman's posterior, and it was created by Charles Frederick Worth, and it was actually designed by him because it was a way in which he could sell more fabric, because you need way more yardage in order to cover a skirt that has a built-up backside, if you will. So you can see that even the bustle itself evolves. So you have a bustle from 1870, which you have more of a bell shape. In 1880, you had what really looks almost like 2 burlap sacks that are attached at the waist that provide essentially padding. You have this 1882, which has steel in it with canvas holding it together, canvas and cotton fabric. And then you have the 1885 look, which again you see the back of the dress being pooched out. Worth developed the bustle. It changed in shape, as you can see, from over the years, and really did not begin to phase out until 1891-92. So the idea that Frances had been the one to quit wearing the bustle, and therefore all of the other women stopped wearing the bustle too, as I said, is somewhat of an urban legend. The story is that when Frances returned to Washington at the end of the summer, she was shopping with a friend in a department store, and she asked to see some bustles. Excuse me one second. And the sales clerk said to her, "But Mrs. Cleveland, ever since the news report came out that you quit wearing the bustle, nobody's bought one, and so we've had to take them all to the basement. But if you want to see one, I'll go down and get it for you to take a look at." Excuse me. So again, if we look at the next slide, we can just see how these changes looked with clothing. And then Frances is supposed to have said, well, I guess if they've said that I have quit wearing the bustle, I guess I'm going to have to stop. But the purpose of the slides that I've shown you is to show that we really didn't stop until the very early 90s. And at that point, we begin to start having an American fashion industry. Caroline Harrison touted the fact that her inaugural gown was made completely and totally in the United States. And she put out the word, and this is interesting when you think about it, because this is really the first time where you begin to see that a first lady gives what we would call a press release. She tells the press that she has chosen to have her gown made completely in the United States in order to support her husband's America's First policy. And there's quite a bit of detail in the newspapers about where the gown was manufactured. So the silk was woven at the Auburn silk mills, and then all of the beading and lace work that are done at the end of the sleeves, around the neck and on the collar, and in the inset in the bodice were done from a firm in New York. But, excuse me, all of it was manufactured in the United States. And I do want to point out that the bustle was still around, even in the early, even as late as 1889. So you can still see that there was a hint of a bustle there. And the French connection doesn't completely start to go away, because Edith Wilson absolutely loved Charles Frederick Worth designs. Of course, by the time she gets into the White House, he has passed and his two sons have taken over the business. She has quite a number of items in her wardrobe that were designed and purchased from Worth. This is just one suit that she had made from Worth that was designed by him. But by this point, we really get to the stage where our first ladies are starting to wear clothing that has been manufactured completely in the United States. So if we look at Grace Coolidge, who had the figure to be able to wear the fashions from the Roaring Twenties. I want to point something out that is also, I mentioned that the idea of dressing modestly was a recurring theme among first ladies, and we're going to see that again as we move forward. But there's also another theme in fashion, and that's the difference between how corseted and constrained you are in what you wear and how freely you can move in what you wear. So if you noticed what we were looking at with Frances Cleveland and even with Caroline Harrison's inaugural gown, you'll see that they had to be heavily corseted, and then they had the restriction of movement that was created by a bustle. Say, for example, how do you sit comfortably in something that's a steel contraption on the back, on your backside? But then you get to the styles of the Roaring Twenties, and part of this was this freeing up of women from wearing corseted clothing to have more freedom of movement, to have equality. And that's where there is this tension in fashion between restrictive undergarments and women being more ornamentation, and minimal undergarments in order to give women full freedom of movement, which also conveys the idea of independence. It's kind of interesting that we see this with Grace Coolidge, because her husband really didn't really wanted her to be seen and not heard. He did not want her involved in politics. He didn't want her making statements. It's very curious. He knew she was beautiful. He'd go take walks down Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. He would see a dress that he thought she would look good in a store window, and he would purchase it for her. And so he essentially helped to choose and was involved with choosing her wardrobe. On the other hand, she also demonstrated a very high degree of independence, because in her official portrait that you see on the right, which was funded by her sorority sisters from the University of Vermont, she is wearing a sleeveless red dress. She has her dog, Rob Roy, who is named as a kind of sly slam at prohibition. Coolidge's comment upon seeing the portrait was, "Why didn't you paint the dress white and the dog red?" He didn't like the idea of her being in this very strong red, as we know, as a color that conveys strength and power. And so, Grace is really making a statement in what she chose to wear for her portrait, which I think is kind of interesting to think about ways in which we use our clothing to make those statements, which is part of what we're talking about this evening. The other thing we start to see is that we have our first ladies begin to help to promote American fabrics. So on the left, you have a photograph of Lou Henry Hoover wearing a 100% cotton dress. She wore it to an event at the White House where she was hosting some of the cabinet departments and the secretaries and their wives. This is from a pattern that her mother had favored. It was during the time when the price for cotton had dropped below the typical floor, and she wanted to encourage Americans to wear cotton garments so that the demand for cotton would begin to grow again and the price could be boosted. On the right-hand side, we have Eleanor Roosevelt's last inaugural gown. So during World War II, as certain fabrics began to be rationed, silk, for example, is one of them, because the silk was needed for the parachutes in the war effort. And so you start to have the development of new fibers. Nylon, of course, is one of them. But what you have here on the right is what was a rayon crepe. Now, rayon, I know we think of as a synthetic fabric. Technically, it isn't, because rayon or viscose is actually created from tree bark that is then wet, and the fibers are extracted from that bark, and it is eventually used with some non-natural fibers to weave it into the fabric. So Eleanor Roosevelt chose this fabric, chose, instead of wearing silk, which she had been wearing in her previous inaugural gowns, chose to wear this rayon crepe gown in support of the war effort. And so it's a beautiful gown. There are sequins on the sleeves. The sleeves are detachable, and you see that there's some ornamentation in the belt. And sometimes our first ladies will make certain colors very popular. And that happened to be the case with Mamie Eisenhower and what became Mamie Pink. And so I wonder how many of us are of that so-called certain age, and we can remember pink bathrooms and the popularity of pink in 1950s built homes. This gown was Mamie's inaugural gown for the 1953 inaugural. It was made by Nettie Rosenstein, who had been a dressmaker and had affiliated with several top-of-the-line department stores. She actually had gone ahead and retired, but she returned to making dresses for exclusive clients. Of course, Mamie would have been one of those. I also want to point out that the handbag in this photograph is a Judith Leiber bag. Judith Leiber was working at the at Eddie Rosenstein Studios at the time. Judith was actually a Survivor from the Nazi concentration camps, her ability to sew is what saved her and her sister's lives. That camp was liberated by Eisenhower's soldiers, and Judith Leiber eventually married one of those Army soldiers who had been involved in the liberation of that camp. So just to show you how popular pink was and how much Mamie loved that color, you can see on the left her bathroom at Gettysburg, and you can see a popular bathroom from the 1950s on the right. And if you've ever gone house hunting to a 1950s home that has not been remodeled or updated, I suspect that you were confronted by a bathroom that looked something like this. Mamie also had pink all over her bedroom, which we've got them, and you can see the curtains and the chair cushion and the bedspreads. So she absolutely loved pink. And I can't be too sarcastic or critical because pink happens to be one of my favorite colors as well. The Mamie look actually was developed by a dressmaker by the name of Molly Parness. And Molly took Mamie in hand, if you will, and explained to her the importance of dressing a little bit better than all the other congressional wives, carrying a certain amount of cachet, if you will. But then, and what ended up happening, which is got a spread here in Life magazine, is that Mamie wore one of Molly Parness's dresses, this blue-green one that is in color on the right-hand side of the Life page, and another guest appeared in the exact same dress. Mamie was very gracious and said, "The dress looks better on you than it does on me." But the woman was so embarrassed to have appeared in the same dress as the First Lady that she tried to hide for the rest of the afternoon with underneath her mink coat, which I can imagine was very uncomfortable. Well, Mamie could pale with her successor, and that's Jacqueline Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy was, very simply a fashion icon. She loved fashion. She had won an opportunity to go to Paris to work with Vogue magazine, and her mother and stepfather told her that that was something that was inappropriate for someone in her class. But she understood fashion. She understood the messaging that fashion could convey, and she used it as a way to establish her identity as the First Lady and to create an aura about herself, which also created an opportunity for her to be a little more apart from being hounded and bothered by the press, and to give her a sense of independence. Her the pillbox hat was a hat that became famous and was adopted by a lot of American women. And then when we get to her inaugural gown for the evening, you will notice that she has got what would be a shell that would be strapless and sleeveless. And we are right back to the idea of having to dress modestly. And so this gown, which was made by Ethel Frankow, who was working for Bergdorf Goodman at the time, she's wearing what is essentially a net shell, a net see-through shell that goes over this sequin bodice that is strapless and sleeveless in order to give the gown a more modest look. Nevertheless, over time, Oleg Cassini designed this one-shouldered gown for Jackie and was able to convince Jack, because she said that Oleg was going to have to discuss with Jack whether or not Jack would be okay with her wearing a gown that looked like this, that Oleg Cassini told Jack that even a goddess has got to be able to show her beauty. And so Jack was sold, allowed the gown to go through, and Jackie wore it to wide acclaim. So I've mentioned Molly Parness, and she had influence on the wardrobes of a total of 5 different First Ladies. We've already talked about Mamie Eisenhower, but this also included Lady Bird Johnson, Pat Nixon, Betty Ford, and Rosalind Carter. Now, I will say that Molly's influence on these other First Ladies was not quite as intense as it was with Amy. Of course, part of that was because Lady Bird and Pat and Betty and Rosalind had all been in politics with their husbands already. They understood what was expected of them. But Molly also had a way of helping these women understand what the expectations were of a first lady, which were to dress, better and more sophisticated than even Washington congressional wives. One of the things that seems simple now, because we have become, thanks to Hillary Clinton, largely accustomed to seeing women politicians in pants, was the discussion of whether or not there should be pants in public. So we have a photograph that's available through the Lyndon Johnson Library website. This is a photograph of Lady Bird in her jeans. This is obviously a very private photograph, probably taken at the ranch. But then we get to Pat Nixon. And in 1972, Pat agreed to wear outfits by Adele Simpson and pose for Ladies' Home Journal in a spread that is the first time that any first lady appeared in public. So you've got this outfit here in the black and white, and then there's another outfit which you have in pink. And I will have to say that I can remember my mother wearing clothes that looked exactly like this. So it became a very popular and adopted style. Betty Ford comes into office as a result of Nixon's resignation. And we know that she is an extremely independent woman, but Betty had been a buyer for a department store before her marriage to Gerald Ford. Again, somewhat like Jackie Kennedy, although people would say there's not really a comparison. But Betty understood fashion. She understood the importance of fashion. But it was also a time when Seventh Avenue was struggling in order to continue to be profitable and to have influence on what Americans were wearing. A lot of that was because of the British explosion, and a lot of Americans, particularly teenagers, were adopting a lot of the British fashion of the time. So Betty begins to work with some of the designers on Seventh Avenue. One of them is this gentleman here, Albert Capraro, whom Betty asked to design evening gowns that could be affordable. This was also a time of very, very high inflation with 18, 19, 20% interest rates. And Betty asked Albert Capraro to design gowns that were $300 or less. And he did fulfill that, and it began to rejuvenate the Seventh Avenue fashion. Another woman who was involved in Betty's wardrobe was the dressmaker and designer Frankie Welch, who had a shop in Alexandria, Virginia for many years. She was actually a close friend of Betty Ford's. She has a very nice oral history about what she's willing to make public about her relationship with Betty Ford. But this is a gown that Frankie Welch made from fabric that Betty Ford had brought back from a foreign trip. We then are going to fast forward to Nancy Reagan. The one-shouldered gown, yes, it got criticism again for being immodest. And this was the gown that she wore to I believe it was the first inauguration. But what she became most famous for was her Nancy Reagan red, which she turned into her signature color. She was very controversial because of what was said. She was supposed to borrow her outfits and then return them, and she supposedly didn't. The press release was issued that she was donating them to museums, but she was very much a fashion icon and a fashion plate. And then to kind of get toward the end of the presentation, we're going to take a look at Michelle Obama, who was very effective in changing the conversation around fashion. She, as I mentioned earlier, she did an outstanding job in starting to highlight the work of designers of color. So Tracy Reese designed this dress, the one that's on the left, and Naeem Khan, who originated from India, designed the gown that Michelle Obama is wearing on the right. Michelle Obama also began to work with youth of color who were interested in going into design, and she continued that work after she left the White House. You all may remember her official first portrait. Yep, guess what? She got criticized for wearing a sleeveless dress for her official portrait and bearing her arms. And then we come to Melania Trump, who, because of her husband's policies, was essentially dissed, if you will, from many of the major designers in New York City, men and women who had designed and dressed Michelle Obama and other first ladies who preceded Melania. This is the outfit that Mrs. Trump wore for the first Trump inauguration. Ralph Lauren was more than happy to create this outfit for her. A lot of people said she was channeling Jacqueline Kennedy. I can understand why people would think that. That's not my opinion, but we all have opinions, and just that happens to be mine. Melania sent a lot of mixed messages with her clothes, and that's something that we've discussed, is how do you use your clothing to convey messaging. So you've got this Dolce & Gabbana jacket for $51,000 that she wore to a G7 event here on the left. In the center is a jumpsuit and an outfit that is, color appropriate for being in the nation of India. That was designed by Melania's stylist, Hervé Pierre. And then you have a Reem Acra gown on the right. And Reem Acra is another designer who has been willing to design for Melania and is also designed for Jill Biden as well. Jill Biden is dressed very conservatively. She has stuck with a lot of the tried and true designers. One of her favorites is Oscar de la Renta, and we saw her in a lot of Oscar de la Renta dresses. Again, we're kind of back to this very tailored look, somewhat of a restrictive look. But then when you talk about restrictive looks, and this is something that Vanessa Friedman, who is the senior fashion editor of New York Times, has been pointing out about Melania Trump's choices. Melania Trump has gone back to that very corseted look with her Dior suits that are very structured for this, for her official portrait, in which she is wearing slacks and a cummerbund and a jacket. And then I think this outfit that she wore when she went to testify before a congressional committee is a pantsuit that was designed for her by Ralph Lauren. So you can see that we run a huge gamut of what fashion is, how first ladies have used it as a platform, or how first ladies have sent mixed messages by using it. And until the day when we have a first gentleman, I suspect it's going to continue like this, because it's been like this already for 250 years. So thank you. And I've run kind of long, but let's have, Nikki, we got some questions.
Thank you so much, Annette. What an incredible program. Thank you. We do have a couple of questions. In your opinion, which first lady impacted American fashion the most?
Well, I mean, to be honest, there are certain times in which first ladies impacted fashion more than, it really depends on the time period. So I'll just more or less stick with, my lifetime, which would really take us, Mamie Eisenhower when I was still relatively young to who we've got now. I think there's no question that Jacqueline Kennedy did have an impact on fashion from the standpoint of changing the conversation about what a first lady could and should wear. She set a new standard that made it challenging for her successors to be able to follow in her footsteps, because most of her successors were not necessarily oriented or had the upbringings that she had. I think Pat Nixon broke the ice when she wore slacks in the Ladies' Home Journal spread, but I think it's really Hillary Clinton with the adoption of a pantsuit that had influence. And I think also we are seeing that Michelle Obama had a huge influence on fashion, because she demonstrated that she could mix both what we call the high and the low. She could, mix something from Manolo Blahnik with something that she had gotten from J. Crew. So it's just very interesting. And a lot of it just has to do with whenever the time period was.
Oh, absolutely interesting. I think we have time for one more question. Were there any first ladies criticized politically for what they wore?
Well, I guess you could make the comment that any criticism of First Lady is political,
Yeah.
because supporters of her husband's policies will typically also say that she's doing a great job in supporting him with what she chooses to wear. And the critics will say, look how she's dressing. It's immodest, or it's inappropriate, or it costs too much. Or it's kind of like this one congressman said about Grover Cleveland. I hate Grover Cleveland so much, I don't even think his wife is beautiful. So, it becomes a matter of which side of the political spectrum are you on? What are you going to say about what the First Lady's wearing? And I think that's a lot of also what happened with Mary Todd Lincoln. Their emotions were so high during the Civil War. She was the lightning rod that drew a lot of that criticism to her. Some of it, unfortunately, she just had a political tin ear. She didn't realize what was going on. But on the other side of that, you have Martha Washington, who figured it out right out of the gate, that the best way for people to appreciate her husband and appreciate this new government that they were implementing was for her not to call attention to herself, but to dress in a way that kind of downplayed her role in this new government that was now in place.
Thank you. I think we'll ask Nancy to please close our program at this point. It's been really spectacular. Thank you.
Thank you.
It has been so interesting. And before I close, I just want to make one comment that when Diana Carlin and I were writing 2 chapters on Michelle Obama for the First Lady's Companion that Kate Sibley edited, it was amazing to us, all the articles on what Michelle Obama's sleeveless White House portrait meant. I mean, there are so many in academia on what image she was showing wearing a sleeveless dress. So I'll just say that fashion certainly does play into the politics of a First Lady's role. And I also will say, I'll just add this one other thing. When Michelle Obama and Laura Bush did the first African First Lady Summit, Michelle talked about, how she wanted to project policy. And then there was the bang issue, and they're back and forth about, they really wish that people would look at their policy rather than whether their hairstyle is bangs or not. But thank you for a wonderful program. Please keep up with Flair issues. Join Flair if you haven't at flair-net, flair-net.org. We really, really would love new members, and we'll have more interesting virtual programs coming up on a monthly basis. And we have a new podcast. So thank you both, Annette and Nikki, for a really enjoyable evening.
Thank you.
Good night.